Okay, we're going to do one, and we've been asked to, for the Windover Bog bodies that have been found in the Windover area of Florida. It's a great name, Windover, Florida. I heard, and I can't verify this or not, and haven't tried to really, but Windover was looked at as some place like Kitty Hawk, and that it had a perpetual wind that could have been used in that situation also in early flight. And for some reason after that, the site of Cape Kanavral, which is not too far from here, some 20 miles away or something, um, was picked in the idea of space flight, that it would be more safe for people, for everything back this way was really pretty much not inhabited very much, and it was kind of set out on a peninsula, and of course would be taking it out over the ocean and give an idea for a waterfall as opposed to anything else. But this picture here is kind of revealing. It shows you the way that they had them. They were pinned under stakes, which apparently are about the size of a spear, if you will, and held down almost in a made basket form around the body, and then cinched at the top of it. And each basket was then again pinned with a larger stick that shone through it here and here and here and through here, and that pinned him down into the peat of the bog. They're usually, again, like many Caucasian burials, are buried on their left side, facing the east or the west, to the north, and strangely these, instead of facing the east, are facing west, but on the left hand side. And the depiction of the Caucasoid, not really Amerindian depiction, is somewhat correct in this endeavor. We'll get into the information that correlates to that as it unfolds itself. Now, the Windover Bog bodies are among the greatest archaeological discoveries ever unearthed in the United States. It was only after the bones were declared very old and not the product of a mass murder that the 167 bodies found in a pond in Windover, Florida, began to stir up excitement in the archaeological world. Researchers from Florida State University came to the site thinking some more Native American bones had been unearthed in the swamplands, but not. They were guessing that the bones were 500 to 600 years old, but then the bones were radiocarbon dated, and it turns out the corpses range from 6,900 years to 8,120 years old, or over 6,100 years old. It was then that the academic community became incredibly excited, and the Windover Bog was proven to be one of the most important archaeological finds in the United States. In 1982, C. Vanderjagt, the man who made the find, was using a backhoe to demuck the pond for the development of a new subdivision located about halfway between Disney World and Cape Kanavral, where the space shoot from, Saturn rockets and so on. Vanderjagt was confused by the large number of rocks in the pond, as that area of Florida was not known to be particularly rocky. So he already noted that strangeness. Getting out of his backhoe, Vanderjagt noticed or went to investigate, and almost immediately realized that he had unearthed a huge pile of bones. He called the authorities right away, and it was only thanks to his natural curiosity that the site was preserved, and after the medical examiners declared them ancient by the specialists from Florida State University were summoned. Another brilliant move by Vanderjagt. Too often sites are ruined because experts aren't called at the first. Deeply intrigued, EKS Incorporation, the developers of the site itself, financed the radiocarbon dating once the striking dates were revealed, and the state of Florida providing a grant for the excavation. And there was to end up debogging the area and actually pump out the water was used $60,000 worth of pumping equipment that was also given to them. So this is this boggish type of area that was going to be reclaimed, but then something special was stumbled up upon. Unlike the human remains found in European bogs, the Florida bodies are only skeletons. No flesh remains on the bones, but this doesn't negate their significance. Nearly half of the skulls contained brain matter. The majority of skeletons were found lying on their left sides, with their heads pointing westwards, perhaps towards the setting sun, and their faces pointing up towards the north. Most had their legs tucked up, as in the fetal position. The only thing that they're missing, instead of being buried in a symbolic pit that is a symbolic womb covered with red ochre, they're in these baskets, submerged below water in a protected state, almost like fetuses are, kept inside a amniotic sac, right? They were found with incredible weaving patterns and stuff too in their fabrics. It doesn't go with Indians in any way, shape, or form, who are still using hides and leathers and things like that well into the colonization of America. Let's see here. Most had their legs tucked up in the fetal position. However, 3 were lying straight. Interestingly, each corpse had a stake thrust through the loose fabric that enshrouded them, so like the burial sack that was held down, presumably to prevent them from floating to the surface of the water as decomposition filled them with air. This practical step was what ultimately protected the bodies from scavengers, like animals and grave robbers perhaps, and kept them in their intended positions, or kept them sacred, or kept them untouched until this time. And it's one way that we can have a good verification of it all. The Calusa people, lost tribe of Florida that early European explorers wrote home about. Oh yeah, I got to tell you all about that. First humans in Florida found lived amongst the giant animals. Rare corn horde versus, yeah. So all the way back then. So here's the way it looks, guys. And so here are these guys, how they're working in Florida all in the sun all day. So they're just going to be wearing shorts and stuff. And you can probably imagine them going through the summertime, but they're digging down. Now in this area, they're about 3 foot deep in a lot of it. But in other areas, they get over 6 and 7 foot deep. They actually go deeper than, and quite a bit deeper than, to ensure the fact that they're past the point of anybody. But then, of course, eventually it's going to get used in a ceremonial way that it was supposed to be before. The find provides unparalleled insight into a hunter-gatherer community that existed 3,500 years before the pyramids. So that long ago. You know, it's connective if you look at it. And we recently were talking about a giant boat dock that's been found off the Isle of Wight in 35 foot deep of water, back when the ocean was at its lower point, and being built along the same timeline and stuff. And if you wonder where those people could have been boating to, stay in tune. We'll talk about it a little bit on a few other videos, but this one indeed too. The skeletons and the artifacts found with them have been studied almost continuously in the decades since their discovery. The research paints a picture of hard but good life in pre-Columbian Florida. Though living mainly off what they could hunt and gather, the community was sedentary, so satiated, right? Indicating that whatever hardships they may have faced were small compared with the benefits of the area that they choose to settle in. Theirs was an incredible caring society. Children's bodies were almost all found to have small toys in their arms. One older woman, perhaps 50 years of age or so, showed signs of having several broken bones. The fractures occurred several years before her death, meaning that despite her handicap, the other villagers cared for her and helped her even when she could no longer contribute significantly to the workload. You can see this in a lot of ancient Caucasian societies, though, but so far away, it's interesting to find. Another body, that of a 15-year-old boy, showed that he was a victim of spina bifida, a crippling birth defect where the vertebrae do not grow together properly around the spinal cord. Quite often is exposed, and quite often this person is disabled and cannot walk, and so on, right? Despite his many deformed bones, evidence suggests that he was loved and cared for throughout his life. These discoveries are mind-boggling when one considers how many ancient and even few modern societies abandon the weak and deformed at this point. And you can see here they're dug down pretty much head deep to the flatness of where they are, but then of course if we're looking at this level around them here, it's over their head. It's got to be going down over 10 foot now, and they keep looking a little bit deeper to make sure they found everything in this exact spot, for it seemed to have been so sacred. Contents found with the corpses, as well as organic remains found in the bog, reveal an ecosystem rich in diversity. 30 species of edible and/or medicinal plants were identified by paleobotanists. Berries and small fruits were particularly important to the community's diet. One woman, perhaps about 35 years old, was found with a concoction of elderberry, nightshade, and holly in the area where her stomach would have been, suggesting that she was eating medicinal herbs to try and combat an illness. Unfortunately, the combination did not work, and whatever afflicted the woman ultimately took her life. Interestingly, the elderberry woman, as she was called, was one of the few bodies that were stretched out as opposed to being curled up in a fetal position, with her face was pointing downward. In other Native American tradition, elderberries were used to fight viral infections, and so it might be something that she used or that would have been the cause and effect. Other striking differences between the Windover Bog people and their European counterparts is that none of the Floridians suffered violent deaths, which were on the European bog people, sometimes it looked like they were done as sacrifices. The bodies include men, women, and children. Roughly half the bodies were younger than 20 years old when they died, but some were well over 70 years old. This was fairly good mortality rate for the place and time. The presence of brain matter in 91 of the bodies suggested that they were buried quickly or within 48 hours of death and weren't consumed by a lot of things that could have been part of this bog. And so another reason that they're lucky that it was preserved in such a way. The presence of brain matter in 91, though, shows that they were cared for and buried early after passing, much like burials that we go on today, but we use a preservation method that almost mimics the Egyptians in some way, but we don't desiccate and dehydrate people up. We try to make them as natural as possible until they can be interred. Scientists know this because given the hot, humid climate of Florida, brains would have liquefied in the bodies if they weren't buried quickly. Now let's look at a little showing of it here, if it'll pop up.
Today, scientists are analyzing material from America's most intriguing archaeological site.
God, it's quiet.
This rare material holds vital clues to the origins of native North Americans, and the scientists are on the brink of an incredible discovery. Yet the story of the unearthing of the Windover site itself is just as remarkable as anything they found buried within it. Cape Kanavral, southern Florida, 220 square miles of undisturbed marshland. Vanderjack needed to clear a path through a marshy area known as the Windover Bog. Before long, something unusual caught his eye. It looked like a rock.
The first one that came out, when I threw it off to the side to dump it out, I saw it roll off from the pile a little bit, and I found it a little strange because you don't see a lot of rocks and stones here coming out. So I jumped off to take a look to see what it was that I did pick up out of there. And as I turned it around, it was looking at me. And that's when we
Skull.
stopped.
In the bucket of his backhoe, Steve Vanderjack had found human remains, a skull. Vanderjack thought he'd stumbled upon evidence of murder.
Maybe some foul play, maybe an accident, maybe somebody stumbled off in there, or you don't know.
News of the discovery traveled fast, and Chief Developer Jim Swan rushed to the site.
So, of course, they think it could have something to do with foul play and things at first. You don't never know how old these things are, and it takes a specialist looking at them to try to figure out how old they are. I'm not going to show this because I'll just get flagged at it, and the sound is about as worst as any video that I've done. But this is what that site looks
It was
like.
everything Dorn had hoped for, and more. Sealed in an airtight cocoon of peat, the fungi and bacteria that cause decay were shut out. What's more, the Windover peat itself was special. Not acidic like most peat, but neutral and perfect for the conservation of bones.
It's virtually an optimal environment. You couldn't ask for a better preservation medium.
So basically, it was put in a non-rotting environment, and a lot of the bones that reason we can't find them is because the natural decay of things becomes acidic, and then that uses up all the minerals and casts out the calcium of bones even and stuff, and disintegrates everything away. But you can find special bogs and media that have preserved bodies in a special way, just like the desert has preserved bodies in a special way, just like ice can preserve bodies in a special way. Somewhat amazingly, DNA analysis of the remains show that these bodies share no biological affiliation with the more modern Native American groups known to have lived in the area. Recognizing the limitations of modern technology, about half the Windover site was left intact as a protected natural historic landmark, so that in 50 or 100 years researchers could return to the bog and excavate the untouched remains and get a whole nother role going through about it. You know, some people say, well, that's neat. Other people say, well, it's been long enough. Let's find out more, and and keep going deeper into it. And if we look into it, here's the Windover Archaeological site that they're talking about in this bog area that got grown over by mangroves and stuff, and really much was left over. And if we look, you can barely make it out in here if you can even at all. Let's see. Where it is up in this area of Florida, up near Cape Kanavral and stuff. Disney World's over here. And so what was interesting about this is they talk about the kids, and that they even had osteoarthritis. Pelvis bone of one male had a spear point embedded into it. Others had severe skull fractures. So he's saying that nobody had any problems. There are people that still had problems in this group, but it didn't look like they were sacrificed in any way. So it isn't that different, it's just different. We'll go with it that far, right? And the interesting part about it, in 84, archaeologists discovered that the brain tissue had survived in many of the skull. Lumps of gray or greasy brown material was found in several of the skulls, and they were open for examination. Suspecting that this was the brain tissues, researchers sent intact skulls for X-ray and CAT scans and MRI, which showed recognizable brain structures. In addition, cell structures were seen under a microscope. At least 90 of the recovered bodies had brain tissue that survived due to the preservation effects of the peat. The state of preservation of the brain tissue allowed a determination that the bodies were buried in peat within 24 to 48 hours of their death, and this preservation allowed researchers to sequence DNA from the brains 8,000 years later. The DNA indicated Asian origin, similar to that of the 4 other major haplotypes of major American people, and a relatively rare Haplogroup X. The DNA also indicated that one family had used this grave site for over a century. Gut contents were found with many of the barrels. These include seeds of wild grapes, elderberries, and prickly pear fruit, often in large quantities. The people's teeth were worn down early in life, presumably from sand and food, but few had any cavities again also. And that's probably for another video altogether. But what I want to show you is what they say Haplogroup X. And its extent for Haplogroup X is something that was found in Caucasians of a mitochondrial DNA. It's found in America, Europe, Western Asia, North Africa, and through the Horn of Africa. Special in a different way than that. It appears to be an offshoot as they were coming out, and where you find X at is in Anatolia in Asia Minor and Greece, right? But all over North Africa and basically Caucasian lands here, North Africa, Egypt, a little on the Horn of Africa, but Yemen, all the way around and through, and even the pocket that's out here. I did a video about this recently, but this shows the other connection. And when I think whenever I did that video, somebody said, hey, show the connection to this. And so I thought, well, I did a video about 2 years ago about it, kind of, but not to this extent. Here's something a little more about it, but yeah. So, but where is it found? Well, in Northeast Amerindians, it's found, right? And also in the haplogroups of today, remnants of what comes from it. Now, there's an odd difference in there. There's a haplogroup strains that come from things, and there's X1 and X2, and that they see out of this. But the concentration also being here in the north and going from there, if we were to put this map, not separating these two, but put North America over here, and then this would roll around on the other side of the map, you'd see how it makes it connective. But they don't want to show it in that form. But you can see how whoop, it comes right on across. Now, we're talking in a lot of other videos about ancient boating, and of this time there already being in the Isle of Wight right up here, an ancient boating dock right about at my point that I'm at, an ancient boat dock that is 8,000 years ago, and it's huge. It's bigger than, you know, the famous wharves that you can think of, and it's back at that time. So anyhow, this is Windover Bog bodies, and so there's this Mississippian cultures and a few other cultures that stand out to be quite different. For a lot of people are led to believe, and maybe don't even care, but they're led to believe Indians are all just one certain way. They all look like braves sitting on a horse somehow. But hey, those horses showed up a whole lot later with the Americans and Spaniards showing up here. It's not even work that way. And also there was a lot of cultures that were vastly different from each other. Some of them didn't get along with each other in any way. Some of them were nomadic and went back and forth with buffalo herds, while others, like these, were pretty much stationary and so on. So there was a lot of variation on a theme in pre-Columbian America. And one variation that we can show here, other than Asians and Asiatics and Proto-Indo-European mixes coming over through the Bering Ice Strait and across here, as you're usually told, and into the Americas, forming north and south, you can also see a blend that must have come another way. And it shows up to be earlier than that first one too, Salutreans and so on. But North America got quite screwed over. And in fact, the area that we're looking at gets exactly quite screwed over during the Younger Dryas and the end of the last ice age. So it might show you why there later than that wasn't so much of a remnant, but just some slight admix and some other Indians like Mandan Sioux and so on. But in South America, where it didn't reach as bad, there's ancient tales. For the first pioneers that came to America were thought that they were the gods because, unlike the Indians there, their gods had beards, blonde hair, and blue eyes, and they thought that they were the gods. And they said so, and they saw blonde-haired children they said were the last of the children of the gods, and talked about the Wari and Cloud people and so on, and it's definitely recorded for Pizarro and a few others. But that's for another video entirely too. So there's Windover bog bodies and stuff, and what does it have to do with anything? Well, it has to show that there's quite a bit of variation on what happened in North America long ago. In fact, 3,500 years before the pyramids in date, there were people whose body type showed up in that same connective on the other side of the world. And if you look at the concentration of X, it's here, but somehow there's a good patch of them right here that's not showing, but right there in Florida. Land of flowers. Like, share, and subscribe, guys, and enjoy. And we'll get on to another topic and more connectives. Peace.